Industrial progress of the 20th century has made the United States one of the most advanced nations of the world. But progress has a price. Has our industrial strength left America one of the most polluted nations on Earth? Over 36,000 hazardous waste sites have been investigated and documented by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Nearly 1,200 of these sites have made the National Priorities List, making them subjects of possible emergency remedial or cleanup action. These sites are landfills, industrial sites, chemical dumps, and petroleum re-refining plants that may threaten air, groundwater, soil, surface water, and wetlands, or critical fish or wildlife habitat. In the case of the Peak Oil Superfund site, located in east central Hillsborough County near Tampa, Florida, all of these elements are threatened. This is peak oil.
In the Tampa area, we have 11 Superfund sites, and the Peak Oil site is one of those 11 that we've been investigating for some time now. It was placed on the National Priorities List in 1986.
At the time EPA came in to do its removal, basically the Peak Oil Company had ceased operations. However, all of its tanks, both vertical tanks, its horizontal tanks, underground tanks, were still on site. Many of the tanks had waste oil still in them, some contaminated with PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. There were releases of waste oil and chemicals all over the site. It was very apparent to EPA that the site had been operated very sloppily over the 30 years that it had been in existence.
Peak Oil was noted in the early days of its operation as one of the country's first waste oil re-refining facilities. It was duly licensed and certified for operation by the local authorities in Hillsborough County. Peak collected and re-refined waste petroleum products ranging from crankcase and hydraulic oils to the PCB-laden oils used in electrical transformers. These materials were brought to the Peak Oil site from municipalities, military bases, and private businesses from all over Florida. The used oils were reprocessed into light lubricants and sold at a profit. But after the process, there was left highly toxic byproducts, which remained at the site.
As I remember, of course, we're talking about in 1975, we were looking for a correct way to dispose of our oil, rather than just take it and dump it in some orange grove. And they came to us, and of course, what was really inviting, they offered to pay us, I think it was 10 cents a gallon for the used oil, and we began to use them. We did require them to show us certificates that they were authorized by the county to do this, and of course they were. So we thought everything was good and legitimate.
In the course of our business, we changed oil for many customers in their cars, and we needed a source to send our used waste oil to, and one of the largest in the area was Peak Oil.
The Peak Oil operation was perceived as an industrial discharging facility, which by the laws of those days was required to have an industrial wastewater permit. So it was not seen as a hazardous waste facility. And EPC's involvement with that company, with that site, goes back to probably the mid to late 70s, from only industrial wastewater perspective.
And in the early 80s, we started to notice different publications in the newspaper. Things were not the way they seemed at Peak Oil. There was some problems out there. So Peak came, the driver came and said, we can't pay anymore, things have happened, we have to change some things over there, so we're just not able to pay for the used oil anymore. We said, fine, just take it, because to us it was a problem, it was a hazard, and what do you do with used waste oil?
Basically, the Peak Oil process involved taking waste oil and other waste lubricants and re-refining those lubricants, those waste fluids. That involved using sulfuric acid and other compounds to strip the waste oil of the contaminants. As a result of that process, this oily acidic sludge was generated, and the standard practice for disposal of that oily acidic sludge was basically to dig a hole in the ground and to dispose of it directly into that hole with no liner and no other controls. Of course, here in Florida, with the water table being so shallow, you dig a hole down a couple of feet and you're essentially into the groundwater. They took a sample from the superficial aquifer, literally pulled up water that was pitch black, indicating that the waste oil had seeped through the sands and sediments and had leaked out of the lagoons directly into the superficial groundwater.
At the peak oil site, the principal contaminants of concern associated with the recycling of the waste oil products are heavy metals, which are contained in the oils. These are things like cadmium or chromium, which are related to plating metals that are found in the waste oil. And the other category of contaminants of concern are organic chemicals, principally things like PCBs. PCBs have become a problem in some areas of the United States, such as the Great Lakes. One of the problems with some of the organic chemicals is that they have the ability to travel some distance through the aquifer system without being absorbed or renovated by the natural soil or rock. Heavy metals, on the other hand, tend not to travel great distances in soil materials. They tend to absorb onto the soils. The soils themselves can be contaminated with heavy metals, but the groundwater usually has relatively low levels of heavy metals in solution.
Right now on the peak oil site, most of the contamination is isolated in that superficial aquifer. There were some old wells on the peak oil site back when the plant was operating that allowed the contaminated water in that superficial aquifer to go down and migrate into the Floridan aquifer. And as a result of that, we saw problems in the Floridan aquifer.
Sites such as the peak oil site tend not to be very large. In other words, the volume of contaminants that they can release to the Floridan aquifer are relatively small compared to the volume of water in the Floridan. They do constitute a local hazard to nearby wells, which might be in the direct pathway of the migration of the contaminants. But at distances of more than a mile or two, probably in the Floridan aquifer, it would be extremely difficult to even detect any contaminants from a site similar to or of the size of something like peak oil. The Floridan aquifer has enormous volumes of water moving through it. That's not to say that the contaminants don't get into it and they don't travel in it. It's just that the volume of water traveling through the aquifer is so large that dilution takes over and the contaminants are diluted to the point where it would be very difficult to even detect them at some distance from the site.
We had really good water when we first moved here, and then all at once it just started picking up like rust, and now it's to the point we even have a water filter on our water, and it's still bad. All of our clothes are dingy, and you take a bath and you have this slime on your tub and stuff, you know, your soap don't lather. And they told us, you know, when they first had the problems over at Peak Oil that they would come out and check our water, but they checked it maybe twice and they haven't checked it in 2 or 3 years or so.
When you have a Superfund site near a community that's on well water, people will complain of the quality of their water. EPA certainly is very concerned about the condition of their water and will go in to sample their wells. And in fact, that's what was done on the Peak Oil site. There were numerous residents that we sampled their water to see if any contaminants that were found on the Peak Oil site were also found in their well water. In all of the cases that we found, the water was clean in relation to the Peak Oil site.
It's got contaminants in it, like rust and I guess calcium deposits and different things. And I don't know, it's nasty. I don't drink it.
Many times their wells were drilled and installed in the 1950s and in the 1960s. And over time, these casings began to rust and corrode. They then their water will turn brown when they go to their taps, and lots of times they would assume that it's coming from the Superfund site. Certainly over time, you would say, well, I live near a Superfund site, therefore my water must be contaminated because of the Superfund site, and many times their well just needs to be replaced.
When you take a shower after a long day, you don't feel as clean as you would. You feel still kind of sticky and sweaty. It's an uncomfortable, but it's the best we've got.
The first stage, of course, is to evaluate whether the site represents an imminent and substantial endangerment, either to the public health or the environment. And on the Peak Oil site, it is one of those sites that we determined that there was an emergency situation here, and in 1986 a removal was conducted to treat a waste oil lagoon area. It was lagoon number 2 on the Peak Oil site. It was determined that the best remedy for that particular area was to use an incineration remedy, and so we treated approximately 6,000 cubic yards of contaminated sediments and waste oil that were put into a lagoon on the back of the property.
Basically, if you were to dig down into the muck here, you'd probably still hit some pockets of waste oil sludges. In fact, it looks like you can almost detect a sheen of some sort on the top of the water. We also can see that there are some birds that have been nesting. They look like a red-winged blackbird, making a lot of chattering noises right now, and they look to be nesting in the tall reeds. So looking at it right now, it certainly looks a heck of a lot better than it did 10 years ago before EPA got in here to remove all of the muck that was out here.
On the Peak Oil site, we have selected an alternative where we'll be washing the soil. We'll be putting different extraction wells where we'll pump the groundwater out, and it'll go through a process where we'll clean the water. We'll add some biological or microorganisms to the water and re-inject it into the ground. The microorganisms will help eat the oil that's left and trapped in the sand from the surface down to the top of the clay, which is about 20 feet of really soil that's contaminated.
This is the ash pile. Under this particular pile, it's setting on a liner itself so that it won't leak into the groundwater. And then it's capped on top. The primary contaminant in this now is lead, and the treatment for it will be to actually solidify this material. And what that means is that it undergoes a chemical process much similar to concrete. And they'll take the ash here, mix it with other materials, and make it into a very hard substance that will prevent it from leaking into the groundwater.
Any type of incineration product that results in an ash may have a number of fates. Currently, the ash pile is just covered up, I think, with a cover to prevent any rainfall from getting into it and leaching the metals out. But it could find its way into asphalt, hence asphalt, into concrete, into construction blocks. It could be bound in concrete for paving. But the ultimate theme for its fate is to be placed in some type of media where any metals that are inside cannot migrate.
The problems persist. We have the soil contamination, subsurface soil contamination, and the groundwater problem.
Right.
And we've finally gotten to the point now where we're ready to enter a final agreement with a group of potentially responsible parties made up of a number of different entities located here and around the Tampa area. We hope to have a consent decree with those parties probably in the next couple of weeks. Once we get that entered, we're going to move ahead and get the site finally cleaned up.
As big a mess as peak oil became, there was a bigger mess brewing. The government called it Superfund. Judy Kushel and thousands of local residents call it unfair.
And now all the businesses who legally did business with Peak Oil now are on the hook to clean up this mess.
So in 1980 then, the Superfund law was passed. And that law was passed to deal with environmental contaminants on the land primarily at abandoned waste sites.
Parties who were considered responsible for creating the pollution or contributing to it would be held liable for any of the costs that the government incurred in addressing any of these problems at Superfund sites. Not only could those parties be held liable for costs that EPA incurred, but also those parties could be ordered or sued in court and directed by a court to actually conduct the cleanup. So it was sort of a two-pronged approach. The government could go out and clean up sites where there weren't any responsible parties, and the government could order or direct parties that existed, that were known and could be found, to actually go out and spend money and clean up the site. Those parties who are considered responsible or potentially responsible at the site for the contamination are called potentially responsible parties. Those who are involved with the Superfund process know that terminology as PRP.
I'm not sure who's really responsible. I do know that I'm not. You know, we were doing what we thought was correct, what everybody told us was correct, and now it seems like we are being penalized. And one of the strangest things I've seen or heard coming out of this thing is the fact that they told us we could go back to our customers and make them responsible. And I can't believe I should sue my customers. I don't believe I'd stay in business very long doing that.
There are three key components: the response, liability, and compensation. Those are the things basically that I've just described. EPA seeks to get its money back. That's the compensation part. The liability provisions, which basically make PRPs responsible or liable for the costs that EPA incurs, are also liable for cleaning up the site. And response being EPA's ability under this law to go out and take direct response actions to get a site cleaned up.
So far, I've paid around $3,200, and it looks like it's between another $2,000 and $3,200 to go before Environmental Protection Agency will tell my husband and I that we are no longer liable because of the small amount of gallons that are involved.
What Congress did not understand at that time and did not really foresee was how many Superfund sites we would actually have and how much money would have to be spent to get the job done. Currently, they estimate, EPA estimates that each Superfund site around the country, on the average, the National Priorities List sites cost about $25 million to clean up. Some of those, of course, can be cleaned up at a much lower cost, and some, in fact, cost upwards of $100 million. But when you take the average, it's $25 million. If you do some simple math and multiply $25 million times 1,281 sites on the MPL, you can quickly see that the $1.6 billion that was initially earmarked for Superfund would be gobbled up very quickly. In 1986, Congress amended the law and increased that amount to $8.5 billion, which still would fall very short of the amount of money that was needed.
I did finally agree to the $3,400 or whatever it was that they said was going to be the low end of the scale, simply because I was afraid if I didn't, you know, they were going to come back and hit me for a much greater sum in the future.
Anybody can be a PRP in this country. By that I mean that not only large corporations and small companies, sometimes we refer to those companies as the mom and pops, the smaller individual sole proprietor type businesses, but federal government agencies, state and local governments, universities, cities, the federal government. In fact, at the Peak Oil site, there are at least 10 federal agencies that have been identified as PRPs.
I didn't do it. My husband didn't do it. The people who did do it, EPA knows exactly who did it. You know, these aren't barrels of oil they found in the woods and they say, oh gee, I wonder who did it. They know exactly who did this. So, you know, let's go right to the horse's mouth and get to the actual person who's done this. Don't take innocent victims, and I'm an innocent victim.
Basically, our waste oil is handled the same as it was then. It's picked up by Tim's Waste Oil, who's authorized by the county and the state as a recycler of oil. The only difference is today we don't get paid for it. But basically, it's handled the same way. And of course, my big question is, what if Tim's does something wrong? Then am I back in the same situation? What are we as a small businessman supposed to do? Somebody needs to tell us.
It is our policy to seek out the owners and operators. That's probably the first place we look. In fact, at the Peak Oil site, we have issued administrative orders to the former owners and operators and the current owners to clean up the site. As is typically the case at a lot of these Superfund sites, the owners and operators may have created a problem at their site, but they're unable at this point to fund the cleanup. That is why EPA then goes and asks the other categories of responsible parties, typically the generators, maybe a current owner, maybe a transporter, to come in and contribute their share to the cleanup. All of the parties, the owner and operator, the transporter, and the generators, are considered jointly and severally equally liable.
There are thousands more who haven't even been notified that they are involved in this cleanup. Somebody's going to get some nasty surprises in the mail. That's one thing I haven't been able to quite understand, how they could only notify a certain percentage of us and come up with a figure, a buyout figure for us, when they don't even know how many people are still around that they're going to be able to squeeze to get money out of.
EPA has a vehicle that it uses in order to try to mitigate some of the harshness of the liability standard. We call that a de minimis settlement. This allows EPA to offer basically a settlement, a final settlement, to the smaller waste contributors at a Superfund site.
I think that this is probably the most unfair scenario I've ever been involved with in my entire life. You know, everything we did was right. Right down from calling a licensed company, capturing the oil, nothing was spilled. We felt like it was the right thing environmentally to do with this oil. And these people betrayed our trust.
The Superfund, as far as we're concerned, or the people I know, is being used all for attorney's fees and to pay the bureaucracy. It's not being used in the cleanup itself. I understood when that thing came about, it was to be used to clean up. It's being used more as a detective agency. And my contention is that the government should clean this mess up. It needs to be cleaned up, there's no question about that. But the government should clean it up as they would other things in the United States. You know, they say, well, why should this guy in Kansas pay for this cleanup of this oil in Florida? Well, why should I pay for wheat subsidies in Kansas? Or even more ridiculous, why should I pay for tobacco subsidies in the Carolinas that the federal government is on every day now saying it's bad, it's going to kill you, it's going to kill you, it's going to kill you. So I recognize that these things have to be cleaned up, but I don't think us or my customers, if I choose to sue them, should be held responsible when we did what we thought and was known at the time to be exactly right.
We don't have a facility of the nature of the Peak Oil site at this time. However, if a facility was to locate or relocate into this area, we would probably one of the first agencies that they should contact in order to find out what kind of permits they need to operate in Hillsborough County.
If we were to have sat here and evaluated peak oil in the 1950s right now, we would probably say that the types of technologies they're using and the methods of waste disposal are perfectly acceptable. In fact, peak oil was a permitted facility back in the 50s. In late 1980s and the early 1990s, when this process was done and the risks were evaluated to the environment and to human health, we have a fairly conservative position, and we've taken serious financial and physical measures to remove the perceived risks from the site. Now the question is, if we were sitting here now 10 years from now, and government, like its regulations are a dynamic process, would we then see that as we evaluated the current risks, that perhaps the measures taken in 1990 were really kind of extravagant or were too costly as compared to the benefits we would perceive 10 years from now? And that's not a question for me to answer, But it's something for all of us to realize when we look at a site that generated waste over a 40-year period. And we must have some sense of appreciation that the rules and the perspectives we have in 1990 were not the same as when the business started.
This is another, I think, instance where the government started out trying to do something good, and as most things the government gets their hands into, it ends up being a disaster.
It's too late to do anything for my husband and I in this area for the peak oil Superfund site. It's too late. These laws have to be changed.
For more information about Superfund sites, contact Hagen Thompson at the U.S. EPA, 345 Cortlandt Street, Northeast, Atlanta, Georgia, 30365, or call area code 404-347-3004. For the Peak Oil Superfund site, contact the Brandon, Florida branch of the Hillsborough County Public Library at 619 Vonderburg Drive, Brandon, Florida, 33511, or call area code 813-744-5630.